Chapter 4. Jeroboam Atos stopped sharply and inclined his head towards the velvet-curtained doorway. It had taken them nearly 20 minutes, 20 minutes of lushly furnished corridors that twisted and turned and ascended and descended through the seemingly infinite interior of the library, to reach the room that she wanted. "This entire section is devoted to the subject that you wish to research, Dayman. Do you need any further assistance?" Since entering the library from the vestibule, his voice had become reverential, sepulchral even. Anne was almost shivering with a combination of nerves and anticipation. Behind the burgundy drape lay the final answer to all her nightmares. She shook her head. "No, that'll be fine." She had had the means to do this for years, but had always put it off. Only her knowledge of the doctor's support had given her the resolve to visit the library, all these years after she had inherited her father's ticket. "Excellent, Dayman. If you do need anything, there is a bell pull. Either myself or one of my colleagues will be only too happy to oblige." He smiled briefly. "And you will find a fully stocked drinks cabinet at your disposal as well." Anne returned the smile and put her hand on the drape. Atos's discreet cough made her turn round. "If I might make so bold, Dayman, this also happens to be the section of the library that Mr. Chapel favours. Since any chance encounter might prove, awkward, I shall inform you if he should enter the library." "Thank you, Mr. Atos." As she opened the drape, she pondered Atos's words. If Chapel was a regular visitor to this section, it suggested that his researches were heading in the same direction as her father's, and her father's researches were now hers by birthright. If Anne's spies and informants were correct, time was running out. She silently cursed herself for leaving these final, oh-so-critical inquiries until the last minute. If Chapel succeeded, he would be able to summon the great intelligence to Earth before she discovered a means to prevent it. And that was her greatest fear, a fear that she couldn't reveal to anybody, not even the doctor. Closing the curtain, she walked carefully down the 3 carpeted steps and looked around. The room was enormous, at least 300 feet square. The walls nothing more than giant bookcases stuffed with books of every size, every colour, every form of binding. There were no windows in the room. The only illumination came from the ever-present oil lamps, casting their sepia tint everywhere. Countless armchairs, soft brown leather with high arms and back, were dotted between the heavy mahogany tables and around the wonderfully inviting drinks cabinet, the polished wooden top crowded with cut crystal decanters containing every possible spirit and liqueur. Anne immediately made her way to the cabinet, and even went so far as to take out a glass from within the glass-fronted cupboard and pick up the decanter full of scotch, definitely a single malt, before deciding that she was procrastinating. Having a drink was simply putting off the moment when she would extract her father's handwritten list of forbidden texts and commit herself. And besides, she was still feeling a little light-headed from the sherry she had shared with Mr. Atos. She swallowed dryly before pulling the creased and folded piece of paper from her handbag, and then instinctively crushed it protectively in her palm. This represented her father's legacy to her and her promise to him. Never again would anybody bear the guilt that she carried within her. She unclasped her hand, unfolded the paper, and stared at the first entry in the list. On the Cessation of Oracles by Plutarch. Steeling herself with determination, she put down the decanter and the glass and started looking for the P's. "Derek, is that you?" whispered Louise hoarsely. After the mysterious transformation of the computer, she had thought that she was prepared for anything. But this? The midnight blue demon nodded like a mongrel, allowing 2 flails of drool to whip out from the grinning mouth. "How do you like my new job?" He giggled and stood upright, waggling his black talons and letting drops of James's blood hit the pale green carpet. "You 3 have been very naughty boys and girls, very, very naughty. You've upset a special friend of mine, and he doesn't like that." "Oh, no, I can tell you." Louise shivered. Despite his transformation, Derek Peartree still possessed the condescending, supercilious voice that had made so many visits to the smoking room such a living nightmare. And now he was a living nightmare. It made that droning, overbearing tone all the more terrifying. "Oh no, Miss Mason and Mr. Brown, you have been so very, very naughty. So was Mr. Campling, but he won't be a naughty boy anymore, will he?" Louise almost threw up as the Derek demon licked the remaining few gobbets of James's blood from his talons. "Ugh," he complained. "What a sad and dry little wine that turned out to be." He looked up at Barry and Louise and grinned. "Let's hope that you're of a better vintage. As they say, the longer they're laid, the better they taste." He gave Louise a lascivious glance before clawing at the air with his talons. "You've been far too naughty to let you live." "What are we supposed to have done, Derek?" It was Barry, his tone placatory. "We came to visit our friend. Why have you killed him?" Louise couldn't understand why he was being so rational. The Derek demon chuckled. At least that's what Louise imagined the demon thought it was. To her, it sounded like somebody gargling with blood, which it probably was, she decided grimly. She glanced at Barry and saw him watching the demon steadily. He was smiling, and Louise suddenly realized what he was doing. He was trying to reach the Derek part of the Derek demon, despite the fact that Derek himself was so vile. She added her voice to Barry's. "James hasn't done anything." "Hadn't, Louise dear, hadn't. Please, we can't have incorrect grammar, can we? Such things are so important." Her memory chucked up a particularly gruesome memory of being stuck in the smoking room with Derek as he expounded the virtues of good English to her. And then an outburst from Barry made her turn round. "As he's getting out of here!" he shouted, impaling the demon with a straightened coat hanger. Purple blood gushed from the wound, but all the creature did was look at Barry and then down at the blood with a perverse smile. "How kind! A light snack!" He began to lick at the wound. Louise stared at the scene in both disbelief and horror before she felt a hand grasp her wrist. "Come on," insisted Barry. "We've got to get out of here, now." He pushed her through the doorway and slammed the door shut behind them before taking the stairs 2 at a time. When they reached the hallway, Louise grabbed his arm to stop him. "What about James?" she shouted. "We can't just leave him there." Barry twisted her round so that she was face to face. "We haven't got any choice. James is dead, and we aren't. And I want to stay that way. If we go back up there, that thing will tear us apart." Then she followed Barry's gaze into the living room, its contents as scattered and broken as the rest of the house. But there on the floor, was a very familiar object. The flat black shape of an ACL tablet. Barry darted into the room and grabbed it, before virtually shoving her out of the front door and down the street, as if the brighter lights of the main road would somehow ward off the creature that Pear Tree had become. Then again, pondered Louise, why shouldn't it be true? It wasn't any more weird than computers and people turning blue. They stopped to grab their breath outside the bookmaker's, its green and red neons adding yet another nightmare touch to the evening's proceedings. "The police, then," said Louise breathlessly. "Let's at least call them in." "And tell them what? That our mate James was murdered by another of our colleagues from ACL. Oh, and by the way, officer, that colleague had been transformed into a hideous demon." He spat out a bitter laugh. "I just don't fancy spending another night locked up for being drunk and disorderly." "But we can't just leave him there. What about that creature?" "I doubt that the police are trained to arrest demons, Lou," he shouted, calming down as he did so. "Anyway, it's probably long gone by now." He fingered his chin. "We'll go in the morning. How's that?" Louise shivered, not sure whether it was the cold or emerging shock. "Okay, I think we'd better go home now." And then the shock really did hit her. "Oh my God, what about Cassie?" "Your mum's looking after her." That wasn't what she had meant, and her throat tightened as she tried to explain. "But that thing! It was waiting for us. It knew where to find us," she screamed. Barry understood immediately, it seemed. He pointed down the road. "There's a taxi rank over there. We'll be at your place in 10 minutes. 2 yellow eyes watched them from behind a privet as they ran off towards the line of waiting black cabs. "Naughty, naughty children," hissed Derek Peartree, wiping the drool from his fangs with a talon. "You should have taken more notice of what I had to say in the smoking room." Standing in the console room, Mel was sorely tempted to forgo the use of a taxi and try out her proficiency with the TARDIS. After their recent harrowing escapade with the quarks and the giant wasps, the Doctor had finally relented to Mel's insistent requests and showed her the fundamentals of TARDIS operation. The lessons hadn't lasted long. The doctor's impatience had seen to that, but Mel was sure that she could arrange a short hop to the university campus without too many problems. Then she remembered the doctor's explosive grumbles when they started to materialize in London that morning. Something about anomalous fluctuations in the equation field and quite alarming quantum subharmonics. Besides, the doctor would know exactly what she was up to, and that was the last thing she wanted. No, she decided, tweaking her hair in the reflection from the time rotor. It was better for all concerned if she phoned for a taxi. For a brief moment, she also wondered whether the TARDIS systems could interface with the telephone network, but then decided that this was far too complicated and hardly worth the bother. She'd be better off phoning from the box that the TARDIS nestled next to, in the shadow of Nelson's column. She pulled up the door lever and waited as the great doors opened with their customary hum. As she waited, she made her final judgment as to her appearance. The dark blue leotard and red leggings, the heavy black woolen jumper, a perfect outfit for a winter's night. Satisfied, she shoved the lever back and departed through the closing doors, ready to tackle anything that the world could throw at her. Anne refilled her glass and sighed contentedly. After 2 hours, she had unearthed over half of the books that her father had indicated. Huge, musty tomes with leather bindings and titles ranging from the Gnostic Apocrypha of Nostradamus to Joachim of Fiore's Liber Inducens in Evangelium Aeternum, taking in the Eltdown shards, the Panacotic manuscripts, and the Book of Ebon on the way. The library had proved as enlightening as she had hoped, a veritable cornucopia of the mystic and the phantasmagorical, with a comprehensive index that was making her search far easier than she could ever have imagined. But her father's list was merely the beginning of her quest. He had died, a broken and disillusioned man thanks to Chapel, before he could interpret the cryptic puzzles that the 2 stacks of books had provided. That was now Anne's legacy, to complete her father's work and prevent the great intelligence from corrupting the earth with its evil ever again. The great intelligence indeed, she muttered, her fear abated by the protection that the library seemed to afford her. Such conceit. She tried to remember what the doctor had called it. Yoth, Yog-Sothoth, she announced, and then a firefly memory lit up in her mind. Yog-Sothoth. She prized herself from the armchair and came to a halt as waves of dizziness overcame her. Silently cursing the sherry and the whiskey, she waited for the room to come to a standstill before she retraced her quest along the bookshelves. After 2 or 3 minutes of twisting her neck to read the spines, she finally found the book that she had seen earlier. The Many Eyes, Lies and Lives of Yog-Sothoth, written by Count Alexei Musomov. She slid the gold-coloured volume from the shelf and opened it, and gasped. The frontispiece was an illustration, a shapeless mass with hundreds of eyes and hundreds of mouths, all radiating pure evil. Thousands of extrusions, ranging from whip-like tentacles to thick pseudopods, seemed to writhe from the bloated body, their surfaces dripping with mucus. Anne read the description below the picture, although she already knew what it was going to say. Yog-Sothoth, the key, and the guardian of the gate. Anne slammed the book shut and tried to calm herself. Her heart was racing, and she was breathing so heavily that she was in danger of hyperventilating. Somehow, she knew that this book held the answer, the ultimate goal of her legacy, and that knowledge helped her regain her composure. In a few hours, she could have the solution to her worst nightmare. Dame Anne? Mr. Atos was standing in the doorway wearing a look of contrition. She removed her hand from her breast. Atos's interruption had almost been as shocking as the illustration in the book. I'm sorry. Mr. Atos, you startled me. I apologize. Dame Anne, but in light of our earlier conversation, I thought you'd like to know that Mr. Chapel has just entered the library. Anne had no choice. She had to leave immediately. But her eyes wandered to the gold volume she was still clutching under her arm. She knew that the library's rules prohibited the removal of books from the premises, but this really was a matter of life and death. I'm sure that I don't need to remind you that you must leave all books here, Dame Anne. She felt the flush of embarrassment on her cheeks and placed the book on the pile of others she had located. Handing Anne her coat, Atos pointed towards the darkened rear of the room. "There is a corridor hidden behind the far shelves which will take you directly to the St. Giles Rookery." She heard distant footsteps, but panic reminded her that the convoluted architecture of the library made a mockery of distance. As Atos strode into the shadowed recess, Anne started after him. Then she stopped. If Chapel was coming here, into this room, he would immediately find her books and, if her suspicions were correct, put them to very bad use. There wasn't time to hide all of them, but Musamov's was the most important to her, and therefore to Chapel. She snatched it from the table and hurried to catch up with Atos. Just before she reached him, she shoved the book in a convenient gap that was so far away from its proper position that she doubted that even the magnificent index of the Library of St. John the Beheaded would be able to locate it. 30 seconds later, she was back in the chilly midnight of London, and the honk of a taxi was the final reminder she needed that she was back in the 20th century. For the next 24 hours, anyway. The console room was empty. As the doctor had expected, Mel was gone. He should have guessed that the simple act of telling her no was woefully inadequate against her dogged determination and razor-sharp mind. He leant on the console and groaned. Mel had no idea of the danger she was placing herself in, but then again, neither did he. Not really. Every one of his Time Lord instincts was telling him that something evil was brewing in the mind of Ashley Chapel. Something so evil that the doctor wondered whether the Earth would even see the next millennium. He slumped into the chaise longue with an even more bitter sigh. Melanie Bush was one of life's innocents, a person who wandered into every situation looking for the best in everyone. But sadly, life and the universe wasn't like that. And the saddest thing of all was that he had never wanted to meet her at all. After his kangaroo court trial on board the Celestial Intervention Agency's space station, a trial arranged by the most corrupt members of his own race where the learned court prosecutor had been a dark and twisted version of himself, the doctor had decided to give up his jackdaw meanderings and settle down. At least, that's what he had deluded himself into thinking. In truth, he had been trying to avoid the predestined future that the Valeyard, his dark side, had predicted. The console room was empty. As the doctor had expected, Mel was gone. He should have guessed that the simple act of telling her no was woefully inadequate against her dogged determination and razor-sharp mind. He leant on the console and groaned. Mel had no idea of the danger she was placing herself in, but then again, neither did he. Not really. Every one of his Time Lord instincts was telling him that something evil was brewing in the mind of Ashley Chapel. Something so evil that the doctor wondered whether the Earth would even see the next millennium. He slumped into the chaise longue with an even more bitter sigh. Melanie Bush was one of life's innocents, a person who wandered into every situation looking for the best in everyone. But sadly, life and the universe wasn't like that. And the saddest thing of all was that he had never wanted to meet her at all. After his kangaroo court trial on board the Celestial Intervention Agency's space station, a trial arranged by the most corrupt members of his own race where the learned court prosecutor had been a dark and twisted version of himself, the doctor had decided to give up his jackdaw meanderings and settle down. At least, that's what he had deluded himself into thinking. In truth, he had been trying to avoid the predestined future that the Valeyard, his dark side, had predicted. If he could avoid ever meeting the Melanie Bush that the Matrix predictions had foretold he would meet, he could shift time onto a different track, a track in which the Valeyard never came into being, in which he never succumbed to his dark side. For a time, he thought that he had succeeded. His first attempt at a companion had been Angela, but that had ended quite tragically with that business with the network. But then he had met Grant, and they had shared many adventures together before eventually parting company. Others followed, and he had felt certain that he had bucked destiny until a random and companionless landing on Earth had once again brought him into conflict with his arch-nemesis, the Master. The Master was hell-bent on yet another of his petty, spiteful conquests. This time, He was trying to undermine the Earth's stock markets in partnership with his latest allies, the Usurians. Obviously, he must have been very bored at the time, the doctor mused. Only the assistance of a spirited, flame-haired computer programmer had foiled his plans. The master had left the Earth with his tail between his legs, and the doctor was confronted with one final problem. The computer programmer was Melanie Bush, the companion that the Matrix had prophesied, and she was the first step on the road to the doctor's transformation into the corrupt, immoral Valeyard. He had refused to let her travel with him. He had forbidden her to enter the TARDIS and had sent her away. But she had tricked him, stowed away, and become his companion without his consent. So he told himself even then. He was convinced that he could divert the course of time. The Matrix had foreseen that he and Mel would answer the distress call from the Hyperion 3. All he had to do was ensure that that particular event never ever occurred. He was still waiting. But he told himself that he could still do it. He could still avert his metamorphosis into the Valeyard. Never again would he place a companion in danger. He would protect them, ensure that the dangers that dogged his existence never touched them, never harmed them. And now Mel was blundering around in Chapel's computer systems, and he hadn't even tried to stop her. What was wrong with simply locking the doors for Omega's sake? He hadn't locked them, because he had wanted her to do it. And now, sitting on the chaise longue and reflecting on his actions, the doctor realized that he had taken the second step. He had started to manipulate. A minor manipulation, it was true, but he had forbidden Mel to tackle the Chapel network on her own in order to provoke her to do just that. He slammed his fist on the carved wooden arm of the chaise longue. How long before he started using his companions as pawns in some cosmic chess game? And how long before he was prepared to sacrifice such a pawn to guarantee a checkmate? The doctor eased himself off the soft velvet and stared at his reflection in the time rotor with an inevitable thought. When would he wear the black and silver robes of a learned court prosecutor? When would the dark side that the Time Lords had taken advantage of finally come into existence? He decided that a long walk through the endless corridors of the TARDIS was called for. He started to turn towards the interior door, before remembering the odd readings that he had seen as the TARDIS had materialized in London that morning. In truth, it could wait until morning, but such scientific curiosities had always piqued him, especially where the planet Earth was concerned. As he recalled, the anomalies were at the quantum subharmonic level, which automatically suggested a Fortean flicker, and they were usually nothing to bother about. But there wasn't any harm in checking it out, was there? He played the console with his usual finesse, watching with his cat-like attention as readouts and screens analyzed and extrapolated the data that flooded into the TARDIS's sensors, and then he froze. A burst of information suddenly erupted from the telepathic circuits, an overspill from her calculations, a design fault in Type 40s that the doctor was aware of, but unprepared for, and a packet of knowledge ignited the doctor's complex neurons, ganglions and superganglions with a terrible interpretation. Familiar names, Mel, Anne Travers, Ashley Chapel, churned and curdled with images and words and a name that was unknown, Sarah Quazell. And cackling above it all like some deranged and vindictive raven was an all-too-recognizable figure. The Valeyard. Overcome by the vivid images that the TARDIS was pumping into his mind, the doctor collapsed over the console, his hands desperately reaching for the telepathic circuits in an attempt to halt the flow. He failed, and lost consciousness in a multicolored heap that slid indecorously onto the pristine white floor. Even at midnight, the library and the adjoining computer block were remarkably busy, Mel mused. As she eased herself into the soft leather chair and switched on the top of the range tablet, Julia Prince hadn't been joking about Ashley Chapel's benevolence. Her mind wandered back to her own student days. Back then, the computer block had been a cramped and drafty room in one of the oldest parts of the university, where people like Julia and Chantal had stayed up all night, sustained by endless cups of coffee and packs of cigarettes, in a desperate attempt to meet some deadline or another. Naturally, Mel had never needed to cram like that. Her essays and reports had always been finished well ahead of schedule. Such were the benefits of a good time management system. The surroundings might have changed after 10 years, but the behavior of the people certainly hadn't. Mel recognized the desperate looks and heartfelt sighs from around her, as well as the endless stream of students back and forth to the coffee machine. And then her mask of superiority momentarily slipped, as she once again realized exactly what she was doing in the computer block. This wasn't a late assignment or an overdue report. She was about to illegally access a private research project belonging to a legend in the computer business. She reached into her handbag and retrieved a bottle of mineral water. As she swigged from it to assuage her drying mouth, she opened her copy of Glaus at the bookmarked page. According to Glaus, who wouldn't even be born for another 26 years, the key to unlocking the Paradigm operating system was an insignificant file located in the monitor driver directory. For those in the know, the file was an open door that led straight into the system nucleus of Paradigm, and from there Mel could surface anywhere in the local area network, such as the private files of the Chapel research team. Nimbly maneuvering the mouse, Mel found the driver directory almost immediately, and within seconds was trespassing in Paradigm's system nucleus. Ashley Chapel rubbed his hands in satisfaction. It had been a productive night. Apart from finally tracking down the last 2 books he needed from the Library of St. John, Campling's betrayal had been dealt with in a permanent manner, and Brown and Mason should have been sufficiently frightened to forget all about what they had seen. And just to stress the point, they had quite a surprise awaiting them when they got home. Since they weren't stupid, Chapel would never have employed either of them, had that been the case. He hoped that they would heed the obvious warning and cease prying into something beyond their comprehension. Campling had deserved his fate. As part of the advanced research team, Campling was expected to show unswerving loyalty, and his betrayal was a mortal wound to Chapel. But the other two? Their minor role in ACL required no such devotion, and their actions were no more than those of an ungrateful child. His ponderings were halted by a sudden message that appeared on his tablet screen. Someone had broken into the Paradigm LAN through the back door. Chapel smiled. He liked a challenge. Mel was faintly surprised by her rate of progress through Paradigm's complex directory structure. When the tablet screen had first displayed its rotating 3-dimensional image of the structure, Mel had gasped at the intricate branches and knots that made it resemble the roots that grew below some ancient tree. But Glaus had cut through the complexities with a short paragraph of code that brushed the roots aside like a spade. And now she had arrived. The system nucleus of the Paradigm Local Area Network, or LAN, which connected all the computers at both the library and ACL together. The screen showed it as a scintillating polyhedron of uncountable sides. Each face represented some part of the complicated software, which combined to make Paradigm one of the most powerful operating systems on the market. At least, that was what Demeter Glaus had written. She had also written that the chink in the nucleus's coded armor was the face of the polyhedron that belonged to the printer driver, the other end of the back door, which had enabled Mel to get this far. Chapel aimed a tiny jerk of his finger towards the screen of his tablet, where the intruder was shown as a flickering blue diamond against the blue-black background. "Clever little bugger," muttered Harker, called in by Chapel to watch this unexpected display of breaking and entering. Unexpected, because Harker hadn't suspected that Chapel would be notified. "How the hell did he get this far?" he asked, hoping that his surprise sounded sincere. Chapel leant back in his armchair and raised an eyebrow. "Did you know that there's a back door into the inner workings of Paradigm?" Harker shook his head urgently. "That's not possible. We took every precaution," he bluffed. "And so did I, David. So did 1.1 installed the back door." Harker frowned. Paradigm was arguably his boss's finest achievement, guaranteed to be 100% hack-proof, with ice traps and antibodies designed to destroy every known virus, and quite a few not created yet. Melanie Bush was probably the only person capable of cracking Paradigm, but even she would need help when she entered the Codex libraries. The last thing that Harker had expected was that she would have an audience when she did it, and here was Chapel, calmly confessing that he had sabotaged his own creation, not for the first time. Harker began to wonder whether the strain of the whole Codex operation was proving too much for the man. That was why he needed to know exactly what was going on in those heavily guarded program libraries that Chapel chose to hide from his head of development. He had to be ready to take over if Chapel cracked. "I can see that the wisdom of my actions has escaped you," he explained. "As you know, I have never been over-impressed by the recruitment processes that we have always employed. They leave so much to chance. But someone with the balls and skill to burgle my own private Elan using one of my own machines, what an employee that would be, eh, David?" Harker could see the reasoning, but it still seemed quite a risk to take, especially for someone as security-conscious as Chapel. Chapel continued. "An employee like that would go far, maybe all the way to the top." Harker felt an icy spasm in his stomach at the cold warning. Despite Chapel's positive response, Harker knew that he was directly responsible for computer security. For this to happen less than 24 hours before the Codex was due to run was a direct indictment of his abilities, and the last thing he wanted was for Chapel to start checking up on him. "She's coming at us from the university library, by the way." Chapel tapped the screen with the arm of his glasses. "An ingenious route, but quite expected. She, you know who it is?" If Chapel suspected anything. Chapel snorted and peered at Harker over the top of his gold-rimmed glasses. "I thought you would have realized by now, David. There's very little that I don't know. Her library card identifies her as Melanie Bush, a graduate of the computer science department at the university. She graduated about 10 years ago." He touched a finger to the bridge of his nose. "Of course. Melanie Bush, I offered her a job. Don't you remember interviewing her?" Of course Harker remembered, but he feigned a vagueness that he hoped would convince Chapel. Spirited little redhead, wasn't she? But she never accepted the position, did she?" "No, she didn't." Chapel waved him quiet, his voice containing the barest hint of irritation. Nobody had ever turned down a position at ACL, except Melanie Bush. And now she was breaking and entering into their systems. A hacker of quite monumental nerve and knowledge, guilty of an almost undetectable fraud in the university's computers, a worthy opponent. Let's see what she makes of the system's nucleus, shall we? "You're not letting her in, are you? What about the deadline for the Codex?" If Chapel carried out a full investigation, there was a chance that Harker would be implicated, and he wasn't quite ready to show his hand. "If she's as clever as she appears to be, there won't be much I can do about it, David," Chapel sighed. "I designed the back door so that only a genius of my abilities could unlock it, and as much as it pains me to say it, I seem to have met my match." The sum total of Chapel's computing resources hung within easy reach, like software Christmas tree ornaments glittering in the firmament of cyberspace. Then Mel chastised herself for such a twee allegory and referred back to Glaus for her next move. She could have read and memorized the entire chapter back in the TARDIS, but she had decided to make the situation more exciting by going through it step by step. A typed password later, Mel was hurtling down a directory chain, the one that Julia Prince had indicated led to the mysterious Codex. "She knows what she's looking for," growled Harker, and then cursed himself for saying it. Chapel shot him a quizzical look. "Indeed. Now how does she know that?" Harker shrugged. "Coincidence? Quite a coincidence that she's heading straight towards the Codex, wouldn't you say?" He shook his head. "When this display is over, I want you to conduct a full investigation into our security. Flopticals going missing, hackers in the system. I've never believed in coincidence, David, and neither should you." But any further insinuations were cut short by the activity on the monitor. The intruder was cutting through the ice traps and crippling the antibodies as if they weren't even there. As the final layer of anti-intrusion software peeled away, Mel clapped her hands in glee. "I'm in," she thought proudly, patting Glaus. Moments later, the protocols and passwords supplied by Julia went to work, and the Codex directory was wide open. She peered at the contents of the directory. Things that she assumed were programs floated past the screen like multicolored balloons, with strange alphanumeric labels hanging underneath them. C, V34, C OSU 5, C664716, and none of them made the slightest sense to Mel. For the briefest of moments, panic gripped her, before she reassured herself that she had got this far without any help, apart from Glaus. Everything she had done up till now had simply been preparation. Now that she was inside Ashley Chapel's secret treasure trove, Mel remembered that Julia Prince had been convinced that her sharp mind would instantly discern its secrets. She shrugged. With nothing else to go on, there was only one course of action. Picking one of the balloons at random, she opened it up for a closer look. "She's opened up CV-34, Harker observed, before realizing that Chapel wasn't doing anything to stop her. "Aren't you going to do something?" Chapel smiled. "Why? CV-34 is one of the last 3 modules that need debugging. And given today's fiasco, why shouldn't we let our Ms. Bush have a go? I mean, she can't do any worse than your developers, can she?" Harker cast his eyes to the floor, more to hide his anger than out of any sense of embarrassment. It was funny that the advanced research team always belonged to him when anything went wrong, but to Chapel whenever there was a bit of glory in the offing. I suppose not, no. And if he made too much of a fuss, it might make Chapel even more suspicious. Quite. She might even have the honor of becoming the last ever recruit to Ashley Chapel Logistics. Louise turned the corner into her street and stopped. Her house was dark. "Barry, the lights are off," she hissed. "Perhaps your mum's gone to bed." He waved his wristwatch in her face. "It is nearly 1 o'clock. Louise shook her head. "No, Barry, she'd wait up. For God's sake, she's always waited up, you know that." Barry laughed nervously, remembering countless other nights when he had fallen foul of Mrs. Mason's inability to accept that her daughter was an adult. "Come on, then. There's no point in waiting around up here. It's freezing," he complained, punctuating his words with little clouds of condensation. He walked towards the front door, its colour transformed from white into amber by the nearby street lamp, and felt his stomach flip-flop as he noticed that the door was ajar. Then Louise was beside him, noticing what he had noticed. She started screaming something, a name, that Barry could scarcely make out, before belting up the path and throwing open the door, revealing the same destruction that they had seen at Campling's house. Without hesitation, she was inside, Barry right behind her. And when she next screamed, Barry did understand, and felt it, deep, deep inside.